Coaches. This is something every single coach is dealing with right now. There's a major shift in how coaches are starting to prepare their players. It's a constraints-led approach, game-based decision-making, learning through environment. On the other side, you've got this traditional model, skills, repetition, structure, fundamentals. So the question is, are we actually developing better players today or just doing something different? Today, I've got Coach Gompert with me. We're going to break this down, challenge it, and figure out what actually works. Coach Gompert, can you just give us a basics on what a constraint-led approach is?
So I was coaching in the traditional model for probably about 10 years, and I came across the constraints-led approach, and it's been a journey to learn what it is. Constraints-led approach is really a vastly different um, approach to how we develop athlete skills. The constraints-led approach sees skill development in a very different way. Takes the premise that that you can't really develop skills outside of context. In other words, the context, the game context, is so messy and dynamic and complex that if you pull a skill out of that and develop it out of that in isolation, that it just doesn't translate very well. The CLA approach sees a skill as reading game sense, and enacting a skill at the same time, and that the skill really depends on what the game presents to you. What CLA is it uses something called representative game design, or representative learning design, which means that you want to make the training activity as close to game-like conditions as possible. If we're preparing them for the game, have the drill or the activity be as close to what a game looks like.
What does constraint-led practice actually look like?
The players are playing a game. It might be a small-sided game, um, and that the coach really becomes more of a designer of activities, and they can manipulate the activity, the rules, the size of the court, the amount of kids on the court. They manipulate that so to create conditions in which certain skills are developed, and it forces the kids to find different solutions. So constraints are these manipulations. These how do you change the environment? You do that in a way that pushes kids to learn different skills, or they can't default to some of the things that they might have before. So you really set problems as a coach, and the players are in those games and activities trying to find solutions. It puts the skill development in the hands of the kids.
What problem does constraint-led practices solve?
Fragile players, both psychologically and athletically. From my experience, using a traditional approach, I would do like crossing activities and crossing drills down near the goal. And we would start finishing, we'd start looking pretty good, feeling pretty confident. Then we get in a game and they weren't doing it. And then I'm on the sideline, like, we worked on this. The reality is, we didn't work on it with an opponent in the way and moving parts. And so by training in isolation, we actually aren't helping them a whole lot. It just doesn't translate very well to games. The trick is, how do you create those game-like scenarios in training, so when they come into the game and it's the messiness of the game, that they can handle that. It helps athletes become adaptable. It helps them become decision makers. Instead of turning to the sideline to get answers from the coaches, it's creating independence, which is our ultimate goal as educators, is how do we get them to be able to do this without us?
In this constraint-led world, what happens to the lower level athlete that's had no base of skills at all?
It kind of comes down to the question of what's a fundamental. Traditional approach will often talk about fundamentals as being like technical things, like passing the ball, shooting the ball, swinging the club, whatever. These are the fundamental skills that they need before they can go into the context. And putting a kid in a game like environment with very few skills, that's terrifying for a kid. It's too much. It's too complicated. This constraints-led approach would say, Yeah, totally get that. So what we would do is something called scaling, which means that we reduce the complexity of an environment down to like bare bones, where these kids can learn these like basic passing and moving and whatnot. But it still maintains the really, really important properties of the game, which is you might have an opponent, you might be going a certain direction. So, what a constraints-led approach would do for very, very early learners or new learners could be like doing 2v2. So it's just much more trimmed down, basic. The constraints-led folks think that fundamentals are reading the game and reacting in the game, that it doesn't matter what your technical ability is if you can't read the game, you can modify on the fly. So if you're noticing that something is too challenging, you can reduce the amount of players on the court. You can, make the rules a little easier. So, but the idea is that you're trying to keep the properties of the game present. You're just reducing the complexity so that it's not overwhelming for the new learners.
Under this constraints led approach, at some point, don't you have to teach somebody like directly?
That's a good question. I would say, I mean, directly, they would say rules. Got to tell them the rules. Got to make sure they're safe. If a kid's throwing a baseball and it's in a way where they could get injured if they do that, directly telling them, then they would say by all means. But the constraints-led approach is founded on the principle that when people discover skills, it is far more meaningful and it lasts, it sticks around. So whenever possible, we try to create game environments in which they discover skills. It kind of comes down to this. As coaches, we are experts, but every individual, every player is different from one another, and every player has different flexibility, they have different skill sets. So um, this constraints-led approach doesn't assume that we know all the answers. We just create the environment in which the kids can find the answers that are optimal for them. And if they keep gravitating towards something that is not a solution that's working, then we would create a constraint in which that is not successful anymore. So then they explore other things. It's really about exploration. And when kids are exploring and they are in charge of their learning, they have agency in their learning, they tend to be far more motivated than trying to get them to conform to doing this one thing that we want them to do again and again.
Between CLA and the old school approach, is it just being overused, or is it something that's still viable to coaches?
When we talk about, you know, traditional approach or constraints-led approach, people get caught in different camps. But the reality is we got to do what's best for the kids. We got to do what's best for the players. So, um, there's a lot of research and a lot of evidence that show time and again that the more representative your training spaces are, the more likely those skills are going to transfer. So to me, it doesn't matter, if you believe one side or another, what is best. I coach soccer, and a game of soccer is extremely dynamic. There's so many different components happening. The players are interacting. The individuals have all sorts of like differences within themselves, fatigue, the weather, like what kind of day they're having. So, I've done both the traditional approach and constraints-led approach. I won't go back when it comes to skill development. I've definitely constraints-led approach is definitely more of a player-centered approach. The traditional approach is a little more coach-centered, where coach has all the answers. Co- um, the other thing with traditional approach is that the coach also handles the motivation. And I just found myself working against my kids. It was almost a battle to try to get them. It was more like it was about compliance. Like, this is what you need to do. I have all the answers. When I started releasing that, it became a far more powerful experience for me. They owned their learning a lot more, which is more motivating for them. It's really made a huge difference. Um, I there are gonna be some traditional coaches who, you know, just think that the CLA is like some other bag of tricks, but it really is an entirely different way of looking at skill development and looking at learning. And I think it deserves a look. I think, um, you know, coaches and teachers, we're all on a learning journey as well, and we're always trying to get better. And I think if people get caught in camps, constraints-led or traditional approach camps, I think they're doing themselves a disservice because there are there's some incredible things happening. And the professional sports world is catching on to constraints-led approach as well. Traditional coaches, it's just a small piece of coaching is how you develop the skills. I mean, if we're being honest with ourselves, coaching is about relationships. And it doesn't matter what you do to develop skills. If you have that, you're already starting off with a great foundation. This is just a different way of understanding how skills are developed. We want our kids to be motivated. We want to make sure that their skills are we're preparing them for games, the messiness and the challenges of a game, both psychologically and skill wise.
For a constraint-led approach, what about the repetition piece?
Um, that's really important. The concept of repetition. And I think we keep contrasting the constraints-led approach and the traditional approach, and I think that's actually helpful as a way to understand it. In a traditional approach, um, the traditional approach is let's repeat a movement as many times as possible to get it automatic. Um, the constraints-led approach thinks repetition is important, but it's a different kind of repetition. It's a repetition of attempts in a game context. So instead of trying to repeat the same technical movement, we want to put them in the same context and the same moment as many times as possible so they can explore all the different ways that they can handle that. It's creating adaptability. So it's this idea of having multiple attempts at something that are never actually the same. So it's a different concept of repetition.
You got a player who can't shoot properly, bad mechanics. What are you doing under a constraints-led approach versus the traditional approach?
Yeah, that's a great question because I think that gets to the heart of how these are different. Um, Traditional approach would pull them out of context and practice that mechanic again and again, or like a shot in basketball. It would, let's shoot as many different times as possible to get the mechanics right. So what a constraints-led approach, it respects that. It understands that we're all different and that we might come up with different solutions that even the coach thinks of. So what we would do is put that player under a number of different um, tasks. We would try to have them vary their rather than conform and be compliant with a technique. We would actually have them explore that technique. We'd have them try a lot of different approaches, um, just to play around, just to try new things, to see if they can come up with solutions that might be more optimal than what they're doing currently doing. So we might put a constraint on them that would prevent them from gravitating toward that solution they keep doing. Um, you know, and it kind of respects the individual and the learner that they're bringing something to the table that maybe together we can find like what the ideal thing is rather than me dictating what I think the ideal thing is. And it doesn't mean, they're going to be shooting free throws backwards, unless that works, I guess. But it's just adapting. It's fine tuning, and ultimately what it does is it gives players the feel. And a lot of great athletes talk about feeling, what it feels like. you know that's ultimately what we're trying to train is feeling it and adapting rather than trying to conform to a very specific technique that may or may not be optimal for them as an individual.
Let's say under this scenario, your team struggles under pressure, turnovers, bad decisions. You know, which approach here is helping more? I would say in the traditional approach, you're just scrimmaging, and you're probably like when the turnover happens, right? You might have a consequence if this turnover is happening or this bad decision, right? And so now you're punishing the team when bad things happen, so they won't. The concept is they won't do it again. Correct.
Mhm.
So I think that's where the traditional way would go is I'm putting you in the game situation, but when you do a turnover, you do something wrong, there'll be a consequence to that. What do you say for the constraint-led approach to that?
The constraints-led approach encourages exploration, and exploration means that things aren't going to be successful all the time. But it doesn't see mistakes as mistakes. It sees them as part of the exploration process. When a kid becomes fearful of making mistakes because they're going to get yanked off the court or they're going to get punished, um, you're asking them to not explore, to not solve problems. They would be nervous to try things. So that tends to create very passive learners, that they're always looking over to the bench to find out what the coach is wanting them to do. And it's also not very enjoyable. Like to there's a huge problem in youth sports right now. The dropout rate is off the charts. We are losing kids out of youth sports. And if one of those reasons is because it's not a really fun space to explore and to challenge themselves and to learn new skills, and instead it's this place where I have to go and I have to do exactly what I'm being told, or else I get punished. That is like not really how learning works. The psychology of learning it just doesn't support that. Constraints-led approach it's all games based. So we're always putting them under pressure. We're always trying to find the right pressure point. So, it's always, and that's psychological pressure. It's game and tactical pressure. So it is all of those skills together being worked on. So when they come into the pressure of a game, that you're preparing them for those kinds of moments.
Well, here's what I think. This isn't about choosing sides. I think it's about understanding what players really need and coaching it accordingly. The best coaches don't follow systems, they build them. Appreciate you jumping on. This is a conversation every coach needs to hear.